This may be an old story, and I've read it hundreds of times, but it always catches me up. It is so powerful. I think one reason it hits us so hard, even 2,000 years later, is because there is blood. Blood is a powerful symbol, a deeply troubling symbol. Blood represents life, and blood represents death. Blood represents both love and hatred. It represents sex, violence, kinship, alienation. Blood shows us the all too close relationship between all of them and of the strength and the fragility of the human creature. Our Hebrew forebears understood the ambiguity of blood as a symbol and as a reality. It was believed that nephesh, the life force itself, was contained in the blood. When blood was spilled, sickness or death ensued. So in the biblical book of Leviticus, there are whole sections of Torah law relating to blood and our relationship to blood and the touching of blood and ritual cleanliness around blood. It was forbidden in Leviticus to consume blood because it was unethical to be eating the very life force of the animal you've killed. This is also why there are no Jewish vampires. Leviticus has strict rules concerning menstrual blood and blood from birthing, both of which made a woman ritually unclean, as well as anything else, any person or thing that she touched, foreshadowing your sign of good sermonizing. So in Mark's story this morning, he shows Jesus barely stepping out of a boat on the shore of Galilee when he is suddenly surrounded by a crowd, and a man named Jairus rushes up to him and falls down on his feet and begs Jesus, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may live." We're going to do a little Bible study here. What do we know about Jairus? Share some answers. He was a synagogue leader. That's the biggest thing. He has a daughter who's dying. His being a synagogue leader means that he was respected, powerful in the community, probably wealthy, and known for his morality and faith as well as his influence in the community. But most of all, Jairus was a dad with a dying child. And that means there is nothing in the world that he will let get in the way of his daughter's healing. Jairus decides to go see this Jesus who is already gaining a slightly difficult reputation as a rabble-rouser among the religious authorities. But Jairus risks. Jairus chooses life over reputation. He takes a risk in faith, and he reaches out for Jesus. Except, as Jesus, Jairus, and a large in-pressing crowd make their way to Jairus' house in the high-rent district of town, something gets in the way of the healing. Or rather, someone gets in the way of the healing. Mark is not kind enough to tell us her name, but tradition calls her the woman with the flow of blood. What do we know about her? She's been bleeding for a long time, for 12 years, we're told, and nobody has been able to help her, although doctors have been more than willing to try and be paid. What else do we know about her? Foreshadowing, your sign of. She's been bleeding for 12 years. She is poor. Her meager purse has been drained by doctors for 12 years. And she's bold. We have here a second desperate person in the story, but someone who lives in an entirely different world than Jairus. She is nameless, poor, powerless. She has bled for 12 years, keeping her weak, keeping her meager purse empty from doctor's bills, and most debilitating, as I mentioned about Leviticus, keeping her ritually unclean. Do you know what that means? Because of her flow of blood, she may have no touch contact with another human being without making them ritually unclean for 9 days. They may not worship at temple or synagogue or prepare food for others. And in a culture that revolves around table fellowship and synagogue fellowship, she is cut off from all community. She has been in a perpetual state of dying untouched for 12 years. Her connections to friends, family, community have been draining out of her body for the same 12 years that Jairus' daughter has been alive. Now, this woman does not know any Christian theology because it ain't been invented yet. She hasn't accepted Jesus as her personal Lord and Savior. She hasn't recited the sinner's prayer. She hasn't asked for forgiveness. Mark just says she had heard about Jesus. Heard what? Perhaps he's a traveling teacher, or perhaps a healer who could possibly end her torment. We don't know what she heard, but she's bold. So she risks it. She chooses life over alienation. She makes a risk of faith, and she reaches out to Jesus. Are folks familiar with Dr. Bernie Siegel? His name hasn't been in the news for a bunch of years, but I hear about him quite a bit when I'm doing my chaplain work at Leahy Hospital. As a surgeon in the late 20th century, Bernie Siegel was at the forefront of recognizing the power of emotions, heart, mind, spirit in people's healing. In his practice, he discovered that only a minority of patients ever moved beyond passivity in their healing process. bringing their whole selves, their whole heart, mind, soul, and spirit and strength to the process of becoming whole. He calls them the exceptional patients. He says there's some specific aspects of these people. He says they refuse to be victims. He says they educate themselves and become specialists in their own care. They want to understand their treatment and to participate in a healing alliance with their physicians and their spiritual directors. They demand dignity and personhood, no matter how sick they are. And most important, he said, they look to the future in what Siegel calls expectant trust that is greater than their fear. He says they possess what he calls a fighting spirit. And this minority of patients often do much better than the passive patients who just do what the doctor says. I want us to think for a moment about that fighting spirit in this woman. She approaches Jesus, apparently from behind, sneaking up for an anonymous healing, a secret cure for her bleeding. But has she contemplated the most glaring consequence of her actions? What will happen when this unclean woman touches Jesus? According to Leviticus 17, he will be made unclean. Jesus would be made unclean. Had she acted impulsively without thinking? Maybe. Or had she decided that consequences be damned, she was going to go for it? Was that her fighting spirit? Was that her expectant trust? Was that her risking faith? Mark doesn't let us in on her thought process. He doesn't let us look deep into her heart. But what we do know is that she pushes through the crowd, touches his cloak, and feels herself healed. Immediately, Mark says, his favorite word. Her joy was just welling up in her heart when Jesus immediately whirls around and said, "Who touched me?" Can you imagine how it was for her? Busted. Her heart must have dropped. And his disciples, those narrow-visioned realists, go, "Dude, who touched you? You're asking in this crowd? Come on, man." But in trembling and fear, the woman comes forward and told Jesus what she had done. Now, if Jesus gave half a fig about Levitical purity laws, he would have dressed this woman down and chastised her up one side and down the other for breaking the Levitical holiness codes and risking contaminating everyone around her, telling her she has a big old pile of attitude for risking everybody else's ritual cleanliness with her contaminating touch. But Jesus doesn't do that. Instead, Jesus calls this woman's big old pile of attitude faith. He turns to the woman whose condition put her out of relationship, and he tenderly brings her into relationship with himself. Jesus says to her, "Daughter." I love that he calls her that. "Daughter, your faith, your risk of faith has healed you. Now you are whole. Go in peace. Go in shalom. Go connected to the divine heart. Go connected, reconnected to family and community. Go in peace." And then Mark, like a good film director, immediately cuts back to the story of Jairus. Think of his predicament. He is now desperately trying to drag Jesus to his house after the interruption. And then he is told, "It's too late. Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?" Jairus realizes that Jesus healing the bleeding woman makes them too late for the healing of his daughter. And then he has to endure the mocking laughter of the crowds when Jesus says his daughter is only asleep. And then he truly hears when Jesus says to him, "Do not fear, only believe." And in a risk of faith, Jairus witnesses his daughter being touched, her suddenly warm hand being held, and her being invited, "Talitha cum," little girl, get up. And she does. And apparently, Jesus' first unheard conversation with this resurrected girl was, "Hey, you want some breakfast?" I am not a Greek scholar, but I think Bernie Siegel's term, expectant trust, is a great definition of the Koine Greek term pistis, which is usually translated by the NRSV as belief or faith. Jesus tells the woman, "Your pistis, your expectant trust has made you well." Jesus calls Jairus to enter into a relationship of expectant trust with him. And his daughter is brought to life. Both of them, in expectant trust, reached out beyond norms or comfort in order to receive a gift of life, whole and healed. All right, I want to try a very brief experiment that Dr. Harvey Cox did a bunch of years ago. He's a Harvard Divinity School professor, retired and still alive. I think he's 91 this year. Just a show of hands, and you can vote for more than one thing. Ready? After hearing the story of Mark's, who identifies with the anxious father Jairus? Who identifies with the bleeding woman? Who identifies with the curious crowd? Who identifies with Jesus? That is precisely the same ratio that Harvey Cox got. Even if you wanted to raise your hand about identifying with Jesus, you thought it would seem arrogant, right? But what if the very focus of Christian discipleship is to identify with Jesus in the way we operate in the world, in the way we connect with our fellow hurting human beings and a suffering creation, offering in our own finite way healing and comfort and love the same way Jesus did. I'm not going to make you raise your hands again. I'll stop. I don't want to torture y'all. I read this week from the poet-theologian Marin Tirabassi, who notes that Jesus' last words in our story, "Give her something to eat," might translate into our lives as a casserole in hand at a door where there has been grief, or a new baby, or a pie brought to an overwhelmed new neighbor, or maybe the offer of a slice and a Coke for an awkward teen, or a coffee or a beer with a healthy side of listening for anyone making a decision. Maybe it's making a sign and going to the demonstration. Maybe it's speaking up with a voice for the voiceless. Maybe it's learning about the history of those who have been dehumanized since we walked on these shores. Maybe it's something you haven't imagined yet, but are starting to hear a call to risk faith. Mark's story in the gospel is about the issue of blood. We all bleed. We all bleed life. Some of us faster than others. We all hurt. We are all wounded. And Jesus also calls us all to be healers. We all bleed. But that blood is not to be a blood of separation and alienation, but like instead his blood on the cross, a blood of reconciliation and renewal. May you each day hear the invitation to risk in faith, to bring expectant trust to each moment, and to respond to the grace given you by gracing others, touching others, healing others, and bringing others to wholeness. After the example of and in the name of our Rabbi Jesus. Amen.